Inside the psychology department at Cornell University, sealed in a glass jar of formaldehyde, rests one of the most infamous brains in American criminal history. Measuring 673 cubic centimeters, it once belonged to a man who could speak 8 languages, translate ancient Greek texts, and construct elaborate theories about human linguistics. Yet, this same brilliant mind planned and executed murders so brutal they shocked the nation. The brain belonged to Edward Howard Rulloff, teacher, doctor, inventor, philologist, and killer. For decades, authorities in New York struggled to reconcile how such dazzling intellect could coexist with such cold-blooded violence. Tonight, we explore the chilling truth behind the man newspapers called The Genius Killer. A story where ambition fed by knowledge turned into obsession, and obsession justified murder. But before we follow Rulloff's bloody trail through New York's Finger Lakes, take a moment to subscribe to Sleepy History Tales. We share dark mysteries like this every week, stories meant to intrigue your mind while lulling you deeper into history's shadowed corners. And if you'd like, drop a comment below, let us know where you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. The case of Edward Rulloff changed how Americans thought about crime itself, proving that evil could wear the polished mask of respectability, and that genius in the wrong hands could be twisted into a weapon. The year was 1842. Central New York was alive with transformation. The rolling hills glowed with harvests, and the Erie Canal had turned quiet farming villages into bustling hubs of trade. The Second Great Awakening swept through towns with religious fire and reform movements. Education was the new pathway to prosperity, and every community longed for scholars to raise their cultural standing. Into this hopeful landscape walked a young man named Edward Rulloff. At just 23 years old, tall, confident, and sharply dressed, he seemed almost heaven-sent to the small village of Dryden, just east of Ithaca. His dark hair was carefully groomed, his clothes marked him as educated, and his eyes carried a depth that impressed everyone he met. When he spoke, it was with the refined accent of a learned gentleman, his voice calm, yet commanding the kind of voice people naturally leaned in to hear. The residents of Dryden had never encountered anyone quite like him. Rulloff dazzled with his wide knowledge, botany, medicine, literature, philosophy, the sciences. He could recite entire passages in Latin, Greek, and German. And when he began giving public lectures on phrenology, the fashionable pseudoscience of reading character from the shape of the skull, villagers packed the room amazed by his apparent mastery. But what they could not see, what no one in Dryden suspected, was the darkness already deeply rooted in this young man's life. Rulloff was born John Edward Howard Rulloffson around 1819 or 1820 near St. John, New Brunswick. His father, a Danish immigrant who worked as a justice of the peace, left the family with some wealth, but when he died in 1827, their fortunes collapsed. Edward quickly revealed a voracious appetite for books, devouring knowledge, with a hunger that impressed neighbors and teachers alike. Yet, even as he rose academically, he had already begun to fall morally. By his teenage years, Edward was implicated in several mysterious fires at the dry goods store where he worked. Fires suspected to have been set deliberately to cover up theft. When Edward was caught wearing clothes that matched items recently reported stolen, his secret life finally came into the open. He was convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to 2 years in prison. For most men, This might have been a wake-up call. But for Edward, it was something else entirely. Prison became his classroom, his apprenticeship. Behind bars, he learned the value of careful planning, of masking his true nature behind a facade of respectability. And when he walked free, he emerged transformed. He abandoned his birth name, John Edward Howard Rulloffson, and reinvented himself as the more refined Edward Rulloff. This was not just a new name, it was a new identity. A predator now armed with both intelligence and disguise, capable of moving undetected among respectable society. In the small village of Dryden, he seemed to be the very model of promise. He found work as a clerk in a local drugstore, dazzling both his employer and customers with his knowledge of botanical medicine. His mind seemed endless in its reach. He could analyze politics, debate philosophy, discuss the newest discoveries in Europe, and even display practical skill in photography or carpentry. For a rural community hungry for culture, Edward was a revelation. His reputation spread quickly. Farmers asked his advice on their crops. Politicians sought his opinions. Prominent families welcomed him at their tables, where his conversation became the centerpiece of long winter evenings. Soon he was offered the most respected position of all headmaster of the local school. It was in this role that Edward met Harriet Shutt, just 17 years old, the daughter of one of the area's most prominent families. Harriet was considered a rare beauty, even in a region known for striking women. Tall and slender with long light brown hair that shimmered in the sunskin so pale, it suggested a life of gentility, and hazel eyes full of wit and warmth. She carried herself with grace and education unusual for young women of her time, the result of a family who valued refinement as much as prosperity. Her father, John Shutt, was a man of influence and stability, proud of his daughter and ambitious for her future. The family embodied everything secure and respectable about American rural life in the 1840s. And yet, the bond between teacher and pupil grew quickly into something intense, something dangerously magnetic. Edward's charm was undeniable. He told stories of travel and scholarship, of wonders beyond the narrow horizons of upstate New York. For Harriet, who had lived her life within the boundaries of a sheltered farming community, he was the embodiment of sophistication of the wider world she had never seen. But beneath the allure, there were cracks. Cracks others noticed but chose to excuse. Edward's temper was terrifying, when provoked, erupting with little warning. His jealousy was fierce, bordering on pathological, ignited by the most innocent gestures. His moods swung violently warm one moment, calculating, and cold the next. The Shutt family, despite being impressed by his intellect, quietly carried doubts they could not quite voice. On December 31st, 1843, with snow blanketing the Finger Lakes, the couple married in a simple ceremony on the Shutt family farm. To guests, it was meant to be a joyful union, the promise of two brilliant young lives joining together. But in that very moment, Edward's mask slipped. When the minister, following custom, kissed the bride gently on the cheek, Edward's face contorted with sudden fury. His eyes flashed with such violent jealousy that several guests instinctively stepped back. In that instant, the celebration darkened. Here was a man who could not tolerate even the most innocent gesture of affection. The guests, unsettled, tried to dismiss it as nerves as wedding day tension. But Harriet had seen something in her new husband's eyes, a look that chilled her to the bone. She told herself it was only passion, only love too fierce to contain. But deep down, she knew better. The honeymoon was brief, troubled by flashes of the same rage that had marred their wedding. Within months, Edward persuaded Harriet to move with him to Lansing, a nearby village. He said it would give them privacy, a fresh start. In truth, it was a calculated act of isolation, cutting Harriet away from her family's protective influence. In Lansing, Edward established himself as a botanical physician, treating those who lacked access to trained doctors. He charged modest fees, showed apparent care for his patients, and quickly built a reputation as a healer. The Rulloff home filled with books, classical languages, natural philosophy, endless volumes on science and history. To neighbors, it seemed like the perfect household, a scholar and healer respected and admired. Behind closed doors, however, Harriet was increasingly alone. In April 1845, after just over a year of marriage, Harriet gave birth to their daughter Priscilla, a moment that should have been filled with joy, but one that would soon become entangled in the darkness of Edward's ambitions. Their daughter Priscilla was born in the spring of 1845. Healthy, beautiful, with Harriet's delicate features and eyes that seemed to hold the sharp intelligence of her father. For a short while, the child softened Edward's volatile nature. Neighbors saw glimpses of tenderness few thought him capable of. He read to Harriet and the baby for hours from his vast library, spoke of great plans for their future, and seemed almost devoted to the idea of being a family man. He dreamed aloud of moving west to the expanding frontier. Ohio, he claimed, was waiting for him. He had been promised a position as a college professor there. He painted vivid pictures for Harriet of a life beyond the small-town gossip of New York, a place where his genius would finally be recognized. Harriet, accustomed to her husband's grand visions, listened with the faith of someone who wanted to believe. Perhaps the West really could be their fresh start, but peace never lasted long in Edward's world. At the center of the storm stood Dr. Henry Bull, Edward's business partner and Harriet's cousin. Bull was a real physician and one of the first to take Edward under his wing, teaching him the practices of botanical medicine. He was also part of the extended Shutt family, easygoing and affectionate in the way relatives in close-knit communities often were. And that was the problem. For Edward, even the most innocent gestures from Dr. Bull became unbearable. A cousin's friendly kiss on Harriet's cheek, the same tradition that had triggered Edward's jealousy at their wedding, now ignited him into jealous rages. He became convinced absurdly that Harriet and her cousin were having an affair. By the summer of 1845, Edward's paranoia had consumed him. He followed Harriet when she left the house. He interrogated her over the simplest conversations. He seethed at imagined betrayals. The man who dazzled audiences with philosophy and literature had become within his own home a creature of suspicion and violence. Then tragedy struck. In May of that year, Harriet's sister-in-law, the wife of her brother William, fell gravely ill after giving birth to her second child. Both mother and infant showed signs of infection, and the family naturally turned to Edward, who had built a reputation as a healer. He prepared an herbal treatment himself and administered it with apparent care. Within 48 hours, both mother and child were dead. Such deaths were heartbreakingly common in a time before modern medicine. And yet, the timing unsettled the family. Edward showed no grief. Instead, he muttered strange, ominous words to his mother-in-law. "I wonder who will be next." The comment, cold and callous, sounded less like sorrow and more like a threat. The Shutt family's doubts hardened into suspicion. Whispers began to circulate. Had Edward's medicine killed them? Was the brilliant healer in truth a danger to his own kin? No one dared speak the accusation aloud, but the tension was palpable. The once proud son-in-law was now seen as an intruder, a corrupting force. Every family gathering became a pressure cooker, and Edward, feeling the walls closing in, became even more desperate to escape. He urged Harriet to leave New York with him, to flee to Ohio, to abandon her family and all their doubts. He promised her a better life, recognition, respect, freedom from the judgment of those too small-minded to appreciate his gifts. But Harriet hesitated. Her grief for her sister-in-law and infant niece was too raw, her ties to her family too deep. She resisted, and Edward's patience was running out. The arguments in the Rulloff household grew sharper, louder, and more violent with each passing week. Edward could not fathom why Harriet remained loyal to her grieving family instead of following him westward into the grand life he promised. To him, her hesitation was betrayal proof that her relatives had turned her against him. Jealousy, always simmering beneath the surface, now raged unchecked. Accusations of infidelity poured from his mouth with increasing fury. Wild fantasies of affairs that existed only in his paranoid imagination. And then came the night of June 22nd, 1844. A summer storm rolled across Cayuga Lake, lightning tearing through the darkening skies, thunder rumbling like some ancient warning. Inside their modest house in Lansing, the air was no less charged. Another argument erupted, this time over Edward's desperate insistence that they leave for Ohio immediately. Harriet, weary from grief and anger, refused him again. She stood in the kitchen, crushing peppercorns with a heavy iron pestle, when his rage finally broke loose. He had been drinking. His words were slurred, his accusations more vicious than ever. And when Harriet dismissed his claims with laughter, something inside him snapped. Later, in a confession, Edward would recount the scene with chilling clarity. In a frenzy of violence, he wrenched the pestle from Harriet's hands and brought it crashing down on her forehead. The blow was so savage that she collapsed instantly, blood pooling beneath her as the thunder outside echoed the horror within. For a moment, silence filled the room. Edward stood over his wife's body, watching as her life ebbed away. And in that silence, he felt not remorse, but a cold, twisted satisfaction. She would never defy him again. Then came another sound. From her cradle, little Priscilla began to cry, frightened by the noise, or perhaps sensing in some unfathomable way the loss of her mother. The wailing pierced Edward's haze of rage, but it did not awaken his humanity. Instead, he saw the infant as a threat, a witness, someone who might one day grow old enough to speak the truth of what she had seen. And so the scholar, with the same cold precision he had once devoted to medicine, turned to his collection of botanical remedies. He prepared a narcotic, a poison, carefully measured, mixed with the knowledge of a healer turned executioner. Cradling his daughter gently, he administered the fatal dose. Her cries weakened, softened, and then ceased. The silence that followed was absolute, a silence more terrible than thunder. In less than an hour, Edward Rulloff, the teacher, the scholar, the healer, had annihilated his family. He had crossed the line from respected intellectual to cold-blooded murderer. When Harriet and Priscilla vanished from Lansing, word spread quickly through the close-knit villages of the Finger Lakes. Neighbors arrived at the Rulloff home the next morning, uneasy and concerned. They found Edward alone, calm, composed, with explanations that were thin and unconvincing. Suspicions grew immediately, and with each passing hour, those suspicions deepened into dread. The scene inside the Rulloff home told a story far different from the one its master tried so desperately to sell. The house looked abandoned in haste. Beds lay unmade, sheets twisted into knots as though someone had risen suddenly in the night. Dirty dishes cluttered the kitchen table, left mid-meal, the food half-eaten. Across the rooms, personal belongings were scattered in disarray. Yet there was no sign of packing, no preparation for travel. And then, the most damning clue of all Harriet's beloved traveling basket. She never left home without it yet. There it was, sitting neatly on her bureau beside her jewelry and cherished possessions. For anyone who knew Harriet, this detail alone was enough. She had not gone willingly. Still, Edward Rulloff spun his tales. First, he claimed Harriet and Priscilla had gone to visit relatives in a lakeside cottage between Cayuga and Seneca. When pressed for names and directions, he faltered. The story changed. Now they were in Erie, Pennsylvania. Days later, he insisted they had relocated entirely to Madison, Ohio, where he had long dreamed of starting anew. But each story unraveled under scrutiny. Why would Harriet vanish without telling her close-knit family? Why abandon her possessions, her letters, her cherished routines? Why leave in secrecy without so much as a word? The more Rulloff talked, the less anyone believed him. When directly confronted, he performed one more act of deception. In his neat, scholarly hand, he composed a letter addressed to Harriet, pleading for her to write home and reassure her family. He claimed he would send it himself, a gesture meant to silence the doubts. But no reply ever came. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into 6 long, agonizing weeks. And still silence, a silence more damning than any confession. Meanwhile, Edward continued his charade. He treated patients, spoke kindly, offered remedies, and wore the mask of a devoted husband awaiting his wife's return. All the while, he carried a secret darker than anyone yet imagined, that Harriet and little Priscilla lay hidden beneath the waters of Cayuga Lake. But the Schutt family refused to be deceived. Harriet's brothers William and Ephraim knew their sister too well. She was a woman of loyalty, steady correspondence, and deep devotion. Disappearing without explanation was unthinkable. Their determination turned into something like a manhunt. They questioned neighbors, scoured the countryside, and pressed their brother-in-law for answers he could not give. Slowly, the truth began to take shape through whispers and uneasy testimony. Neighbors recalled seeing Rulloff the morning after Harriet's supposed departure. He was loading mysterious bundles and a large, heavy chest into a wagon borrowed from the Anderson family. The memory lingered heavy and ominous. It was a clue too large to ignore, and the circle of suspicion around Edward Rulloff tightened with every passing day. Witnesses could never forget the way Edward Rulloff looked in those days. Gone was the confident, composed scholar they had known. In his place was a man visibly unsettled, nervous, furtive, his every movement betraying the weight of terrible secrets. Several neighbors swore they had seen him at dawn steering a heavily loaded wagon toward Cayuga Lake. It was the opposite direction from any of the places he claimed Harriet and Priscilla had gone. And the sight of that wagon burdened with strange bundles and a heavy chest haunted the community like a dark omen. When suspicion reached a breaking point, Rulloff did what he always did best. He ran. Slipping away from Lansing under cover of darkness, he claimed he was off to Ohio to fetch his wife and child to put an end to the unfair rumors. Instead, his midnight flight only convinced the townsfolk of what they already feared, that he had murdered them. But Harriet's brother Ephraim Shutt was not about to let his sister's suspected killer escape so easily. Strong-willed and unyielding, Ephraim saddled his buckboard and began a chase across New York State. What followed felt like a scene from a dime novel. Through towns and train depots, Ephraim pursued the fugitive, each man driven by opposite destinies, one by grief and the need for justice, the other by desperation to evade it. Their paths finally collided on a crowded train platform in Rochester. There, amidst the clamor of whistles and shouting porters, Ephraim spotted his quarry. Rulloff tried to lose himself in the crowd, slipping between passengers, using his sharp eye for human behavior to stay just out of reach. But Ephraim would not be denied. He searched each car one by one until at last he found Rulloff crouched in the rear compartment of the train. Even then, the killer's composure was unnerving. Smiling coolly, he feigned delight at the encounter. What a fortunate meeting, he told Ephraim, insisting he was indeed on his way to Ohio to rejoin Harriet and Priscilla. With audacity that borders on the unbelievable, he even suggested Ephraim accompany him as though the grieving brother might play along in this deadly performance. And so for one tense night, the two men traveled together, one watching, one pretending to buffalo, where they shared an uneasy hotel room. It must have been a long, sleepless night, each man knowing that the other was playing a dangerous game. By morning, the facade collapsed. At the bustling docks where passengers thronged to catch the Cleveland steamboat, Rulloff seized his chance. In the crush of the crowd, he slipped away like smoke vanishing before Ephraim's eyes. By the time his brother-in-law realized it was too late. Rulloff was gone, and with him, the last fragile hope that Harriet and Priscilla still lived. Back in Lansing, grief gave way to grim determination. The community launched one of the most thorough criminal searches of its time. All attention turned to Cayuga Lake, whose dark waters seemed to hold the answers. For weeks, teams of men dragged the lake with hooks and nets. Primitive divers descended into the cold depths, battling murky waters that swallowed all light. Cayuga is nearly 40 miles long, plunging over 400 feet deep, a vast, secret-keeping grave. No matter how hard they searched, no trace of Harriet or Priscilla was ever recovered. And yet, suspicion hardened into near certainty. Witnesses recalled how Rulloff drifted between false grief and unsettling cheer, his behavior a stark contrast to that of any true husband or father. While others searched tirelessly, he showed no urgency, no genuine concern. His indifference was its own kind of confession. But Edward Rulloff, the brilliant scholar turned fugitive, was already crafting his next disguise. By autumn, he resurfaced in Meadville, Pennsylvania, now calling himself James Nelson. With a new name and his characteristic charm, he wove his way into local society. He partnered with a businessman dabbled in invention and so impressed his peers that Jefferson College considered offering him a professorship. Imagine that, a murderer standing at the threshold of his long-sought academic dream, and then a cruel twist of fate. A letter arrived. It was from Albert Jarvis, the young man whose family had once befriended him in Ithaca. Albert, convinced of Rulloff's innocence, pledged to help clear his name. For a man hiding behind lies, there could be no worse ally. The letter from young Albert Jarvis, though meant as a blessing, became a curse. It revealed that whispers of Rulloff's past were stirring once more, that the law was closing in. His carefully constructed life as James Nelson was beginning to crack, and soon it shattered completely. By 1845, nearly a year after Harriet and Priscilla vanished, Edward Rulloff was finally arrested. The charge? Not murder, but kidnapping. It may seem strange to us now, but in the mid-1800s, without bodies, without physical proof, the law had little to stand on. Everything rested on suspicion testimony and the shifting stories of a man who could argue his way out of nearly anything. And argue he did. In the courtroom, Rulloff became his own defense. Imagine the scene, this accused murderer standing before the jury, calm and confident, speaking with the poise of a seasoned attorney. He quoted legal precedent as if he'd spent years in law libraries, dismantled the prosecution's arguments with cool precision, and cross-examined witnesses so thoroughly that even hostile spectators found themselves begrudgingly impressed. The prosecutors, by contrast, had little but shadows to offer inconsistencies, suspicions, rumors. No bodies, no smoking gun, just the chilling absence of Harriet and Priscilla. And yet, even in the absence of proof, the jury could not believe his innocence. The weight of circumstantial evidence, the sheer implausibility of his explanations, left them with no doubt. In 1846, Edward Rulloff was convicted not of murder but of kidnapping and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor in New York's infamous Auburn State Prison. Now, dear listener, here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Most men would have been broken by such a sentence. Rulloff. He flourished. Prison became his university. Within those stone walls, he transformed his cell into a scholar's study, filling it with books on linguistics, grammar, and classical languages. Guards, administrators, even visiting reformers came to marvel at the criminal genius in cell block C. Imagine that a man convicted of carrying his wife and child off into oblivion, now tutoring inmates in Greek and Latin, even holding classes for curious visitors. Rulloff was obsessed with a single grand vision: to unlock the secrets of human language. He believed he had discovered a revolutionary method, a key that would earn him immortality among scholars. He poured his years into a massive treatise he called Method in the Formation of Language. To him, this was destiny. Not punishment, not reformation, but a chance to etch his brilliance into the annals of history. And in that cell, he gained not only a reputation but a disciple. Young Albert Jarvis, the teenage son of Ithaca's undersheriff, was drawn to the scholar's aura. Wholly out of boyhood, Jarvis spent countless hours learning Greek and Latin under Rulloff's tutelage, enthralled by the paradox of wisdom and wickedness sharing the same man. their bond teacher and devoted student, would echo far beyond prison walls, shaping Rulloff's future escape attempts and even his later crimes. When Rulloff finally walked free in 1856, having served every day of his 10-year term, the law was waiting. Tompkins County authorities stood at the prison gates with a new warrant, this time charging him outright with Harriet's murder. But Rulloff was ready. His legal mind snapped to attention. Double jeopardy, he declared. Had he not already stood trial, already been punished for the same crime? Could the state simply keep charging him until they secured the verdict they wanted? Once again, Edward Rulloff stood at the edge of justice, daring it to hold him. The district attorney, faced with Rulloff's clever double jeopardy argument, made a shrewd pivot. Instead of pressing charges for Harriet's death, he shifted his sights to infant Priscilla, a separate crime immune from that defense. It was a bold move, and it worked. The trial was moved to Owego, far enough from Ithaca to secure a jury untainted by local bias. Once again, the evidence was circumstantial, but once again, the jury found Rulloff guilty. This time, the sentence was not 10 years of labor. It was death. But Edward Rulloff was no ordinary prisoner. He had studied the law too closely, sharpened his intellect too keenly to surrender without a fight. His defense mounted a sophisticated appeal, citing the corpus delicti rule, the principle that no murder could be proven without a body. And while the courts deliberated, scholars across New York debated the case. Was it possible to execute a man on suspicion alone? Yet, even as his appeal wound through the courts, Rulloff was plotting. In 1858, he vanished from the Ithaca jail. One moment, a condemned man waiting for the gallows. The next, gone as if the earth had swallowed him. The truth was more human and perhaps more chilling. Evidence suggests he had inside help, most likely from Albert Jarvis, once his teenage pupil, now grown into a young deputy, working under his father, the undersheriff. Jarvis, still enthralled by his teacher's brilliance, may have opened the door that let a convicted murderer walk free. And with that, Rulloff slipped back into the world. No longer a disgraced scholar, no longer a man awaiting death. Now he was a fugitive genius, a brilliant predator cloaked in charm and intellect. For years he wandered the Northeast and Midwest, living under false names, reinventing himself as easily as some men change their coats. 1 month a teacher, another an inventor, a carpet designer, a photographer, always respectable, always admired, and always stealing, deceiving or plotting beneath the surface. Wanted posters described him as dangerous and armed. But they never captured the true menace of Edward Rulloff, a mind so sharp, so magnetic, that even those who should have known better still trusted him. By 1861, however, his luck faltered. He was captured once more and sent to Sing Sing, New York's most notorious prison. For most men, it was a place of breaking. For Rulloff, it was an opportunity. Inside those walls, he thrived. He read, he wrote, he argued, and most importantly, he made connections. One of them was William T. Dexter, a seasoned burglar. Dexter immediately saw the value of this strange, brilliant man. Together, and with the still loyal Albert Jarvis, they began laying plans. When Rulloff was released, their alliance blossomed into a criminal enterprise. A gang unlike the crude thugs of the era, operating with precision and restraint. They avoided violence when they could, targeting wealthy merchants instead. Fabric, silks, and luxury goods that could be moved easily and sold for profit in distant cities. Their base was Brooklyn, but their reach spread across New York, New England, and Pennsylvania. Police called them elusive. Merchants called them cursed. And to the underworld, they were professionals. At the center of it all, Edward Rulloff, the scholar, the linguist, the murderer, the mastermind. For years, Edward Rulloff had lived in two worlds. By day, the careful scholar, writing, reading, lecturing, convincing even hardened criminals of his brilliance. By night, the calculating thief, planning raids with precision and escaping with the quiet efficiency of a mastermind. But in 1869, his ambitions turned once more to the ivory towers of academia. That year, the American Philological Association was holding its very first convention in Poughkeepsie. To most, it was a gathering of scholars to share research and ideas. To Rulloff, it was destiny. He was certain this was his chance to step out of the shadows of crime and into the spotlight of intellectual immortality. Adopting the alias Professor Yuri Laurio, he submitted his life's work, a manuscript on the formation of language, polished and obsessed over for years in prison cells and fugitive hideouts. He titled it Method in the Formation of Language. To Rulloff, it was no mere paper. It was the culmination of his genius, the theory that would transform human understanding of thought itself. So confident was he in its value, he declared it worth $500,000, a staggering fortune equivalent to millions today. He even announced that he would auction it to the highest bidder, but the response was not admiration. It was silence. The association rejected his work without hesitation. No interest, no recognition, no immortality. For Rulloff, the rejection was catastrophic. He had endured prison disgrace and exile, all while clinging to the belief that his genius would one day be acknowledged. Now even the scholarly world had turned its back, and something inside him broke. If society would not recognize his brilliance willingly, then he would force them to reckon with him through his crimes. His burglaries became more daring, his rage more visible, his schemes more dangerous. Psychologists today would recognize the signs immediately: grandiosity, lack of empathy, a complete inability to feel remorse. By modern standards, Rulloff displayed nearly every trait of clinical psychopathy. He saw himself as superior, as exceptional, as destined for greatness, even as the world saw only a criminal on the run. And yet, he still charmed those around him. Even seasoned criminals, men hardened by poverty and violence, were drawn to his charisma, convinced of his genius. Among them, as always, was Albert Jarvis, his loyal disciple, who still hung on every word of the man who had once taught him Greek and Latin in a prison cell. As 1870 dawned, however, time was running out. His manuscript had been rejected. His dreams of immortality were slipping away. His crimes, once profitable, were barely keeping him afloat. Desperation was setting in, and then Jarvis brought him a plan. In the town of Binghamton, the Halbert Brothers dry goods store had just received a shipment of expensive silks from New York City, exactly the kind of merchandise the gang specialized in. Light, valuable, easy to sell. The store was poorly guarded. Only 2 young clerks stood watch at night. The nearby Chenango River offered multiple escape routes. Jarvis had studied every detail: the routines of the clerks, the layout of the building, the best entry points. It seemed perfect. Too perfect. And that was the danger. Because genius in books and theories is not the same as genius in crime. And Edward Rulloff's arrogance was about to lead him into the one mistake he would never escape. The night of August 17, 1870 was heavy with summer heat. The air in Binghamton hung still and suffocating as three figures moved silently through the shadows. Their steps measured their purpose deadly. Edward Rulloff, Albert Jarvis, and William Dexter Master and disciples approached the Halbert Brothers dry goods store with the confidence of men who believed they had accounted for every detail. For days they had studied the building. They knew the clerks' routines, the structure's layout, even the possible escape routes that snaked toward the Chenango River. Inside above the store, two young men slept. Frederick Merrick and Gilbert Burroughs, ordinary shop clerks from working-class families tasked with protecting the merchandise that was their livelihood. They were barely more than boys, armed with little more than their vigilance and a pistol Merrick kept under his pillow. To them, the worst danger seemed like a distant possibility. To Rulloff, they were merely obstacles in the way of a perfect plan. The burglars' strategy was as clinical as it was cold. They would enter through the basement light chloroform and let the fumes drift upward. The clerks would fall unconscious, unharmed. The thieves would vanish with their silks before dawn. Not a drop of blood spilled. At least, that was the plan. Moving like shadows, the men slipped through the basement entrance. They removed their shoes, pulled down their masks, and set the chloroform burning, its sweet, sickly scent filling the air. Every movement was calculated, every step rehearsed, but perfection is fragile. And in that still suffocating night, one careless moment destroyed it all. Albert Jarvis, the loyal student who had followed Rulloff for years, stumbled in the darkness. His foot struck an unseen box or piece of furniture. The crash echoed through the building, loud as a cannon blast in the silence. Upstairs, Merrick and Burroughs awoke instantly, adrenaline surging through their veins. In a heartbeat, they understood the danger they had been hired to prevent was here. Chaos erupted. The three burglars froze their perfect plan, collapsing around them. The clerks, hearts pounding, sprang from their beds. Frederick Merrick, showing a courage that history would remember, reached beneath his pillow, seized his pistol, and leveled it toward the shadowy intruders. His hand steadied. His finger tightened, and he pulled the trigger. The pistol clicked, but no shot came. A cruel misfire. And in that split second, Frederick Merrick's fate was sealed. Yet, the young clerk refused to give up. With the courage of a man who knew his very life and livelihood were on the line, Merrick snatched up a heavy wooden stool and hurled it toward the intruders. The blow nearly landed, and for a heartbeat, it seemed the defenders might actually prevail. Beside him, Gilbert Burroughs had thrown himself bodily at William Dexter. The two men tumbled into walls and furniture fists, flying Burroughs, striking with surprising strength for a shop clerk. And when Merrick rushed to his side, the fight turned. For a brief, shining moment, it looked as though the two young men might hold back the infamous Rulloff gang. But then Edward Rulloff made his choice. Drawing his pistol, he fired a shot into the ceiling, a warning, a last attempt to frighten the clerks into surrender. But Merrick was not a man to yield. He pressed forward with fury attacking Albert Jarvis with everything he had. Rulloff fired again into the air. Still, Merrick came on. And in that instant, the thin thread of restraint snapped. Coldly deliberately, Rulloff leveled his weapon at Merrick's head. He pulled the trigger. This time, the pistol fired. Frederick Merrick fell where he stood. His life ended in an instant, his blood staining the walls of the room he had sworn to defend. The brilliant scholar, the self-proclaimed man of ideas, had crossed the final threshold from thief to murderer. For a moment, the room seemed frozen in silence. Even the air itself recoiled. Then Burroughs, seeing his friend dead, made the only choice left to him. He fled. Bursting into the street, he screamed for help, his cries tearing through the night. Within minutes, neighbors and lawmen were rushing toward the store. Dogs barked. Doors opened. A manhunt had begun. Rulloff and his companions bolted for the Chenango River. But panic had replaced planning. Jarvis, bleeding and desperate, insisted they could wade across. He was wrong. The river, dark and merciless, swallowed him whole. Dexter, unable to swim, followed him to a watery grave, his cries lost beneath the current. Only Edward Rulloff, battered but alive, clawed his way to the far bank. Gasping, drenched, and utterly alone, he could already hear the chase closing in. At the railroad station, when police questioned him, Rulloff panicked and ran. It was a fatal mistake. Hours later, he was dragged from an outhouse on a nearby farm, a humiliating end for the man who once prided himself on being untouchable. Even then, Rulloff clung to deception. He gave false names, Charles Augustus, George Williams, but none could hide him from the truth. In the crowded station, Judge Ransom Balcom stepped forward. His voice cut through the din like a blade. "You are Edward H. Rulloff. You murdered your wife and child in Lansing in 1845. The room fell silent. Decades of mystery of unsolved crimes had just been tied to the man standing in chains before them. Balcom added a final warning to the authorities. "This man understands his rights better than you do and will defend them to the last." And indeed, Rulloff was not finished. He would fight his last battle not in the shadows, but in a courtroom. The evidence against Edward Rulloff was overwhelming, undeniable. In his frantic escape from the Hulbert store, he had left behind a shoe. And not just any shoe. This one had been crudely stuffed with cloth to fit the gap where frostbite had long ago claimed his big toe. It was as distinctive as a fingerprint, a damning marker of identity no courtroom argument could erase. From there, the case unraveled. Documents recovered from the bodies of his drowned accomplices led investigators straight to his Brooklyn apartment. Inside, they uncovered a chilling double life maps, disguises stolen goods, forged papers lying beside academic manuscripts filled with his theories on the origins of language. Scholar and thief murderer and intellectual side by side. The trial that began on January 4th, 1871 became a national spectacle. Crowds of more than 2,000 are squeezed into a courtroom built for half that number. Newspapers sent reporters from across the country, each eager to capture the paradox of America's most learned criminal. Was he a misunderstood genius or proof that intellect and evil could thrive in the same mind? Once again, Rulloff defended himself with eloquence and precision. But this time, it was not enough. The prosecution built its case with unshakable evidence: the shoe, the document's eyewitness testimony, and the long shadow of his criminal past. And yet, even with death looming, Rulloff clung to his delusions. He petitioned the governor for more time, not to repent, but to finish his linguistic theories. He argued that executing him would rob the world of discoveries destined to reshape human understanding. Astonishingly, some powerful voices supported him. Horace Greeley, the famed editor of the New York Tribune, wrote that such a mind was too curious an intellectual problem to be wasted on the gallows. Others, however, recoiled. Mark Twain, with characteristic wit, mocked the pleas for mercy, suggesting another criminal could be executed in Rulloff's place if preserving his brain mattered more than justice. But the law would not bend. On March 3, 1871, Edward Howard Rulloff was sentenced to hang for the murder of Frederick Merrick. In the shadow of the gallows, he finally confessed to killing his wife Harriet, years before struck down in a fit of rage. He admitted giving his baby daughter Priscilla narcotics to silence her cries, though he never directly confessed to her death. And then on May 18, 1871, before a crowd of thousands gathered for what would be New York's last public execution, Edward Rulloff met his end. Accounts differ on his final words. Some claimed he sneered, "Hurry it up. I want to be in hell in time for dinner." Others heard only a broken mutter, "I can't stand still." Even in death he unsettled. Within hours, doctors removed his brain for study. At 1,673 cubic centimeters, it was declared the second largest criminal brain ever recorded. It remains preserved today in Cornell University's Wilder Brain Collection, a grim reminder of a man who lived and died as both scholar and killer. Rulloff's case shook the 19th century. It forced Americans to confront an uncomfortable truth: intelligence is not morality. Genius can conceal monstrosity. A brilliant mind unchecked by conscience becomes a weapon as dangerous as any blade or bullet. Modern psychologists now view him as a textbook psychopath, grandiose, manipulative, utterly without empathy. In many ways, he was America's first celebrity serial killer, a man whose crimes fascinated not only because of their brutality, but because they sprang from a mind once capable of poetry, scholarship, and invention. And so his legacy endures, not as a great linguist, not as a misunderstood thinker, but as a chilling reminder: brilliance without humanity is a path to ruin. So now, dear listener, what do you think? Should exceptional intelligence ever weigh in the balance when judging a killer? Or does genius make the crime all the more monstrous? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this journey into the dark corners of history compelling, subscribe to Sleepy History Tales. Hit the bell and share this story with someone who loves history's mysteries. Until next time, remember, the most dangerous predators are not always beasts in the wild. Sometimes, they are the ones who speak with charm, who quote poetry, who hide their darkness behind the mask of civilization.